Before opening in Switzerland, my first antique shop, I'd actually been dealing in vintage cars, and I'd come across two very expensive cars, a Bugatti and a Jaguar, that I couldn't afford, and I realized that possibly antiques might be a better way for me to move forward. In that period, English antiques were highly fashionable throughout Europe, and the Swiss dealers, a couple of them in Bern, were selling at incredible prices. And I just thought I can beat these guys. So I bought myself a little van in England and filled it up with antiques. I rented a cellar in the part of Bern and eventually managed to get there. There's a long story behind that because you couldn't drive across Europe in those days full of commercial furniture without a guarantee. I didn't have the money for guarantees. But I actually flew the thing out from Southend on a transporter to Basel in Switzerland. I was very fortunate. Quickly, two social ladies picked me up and introduced me to the right type of people in Bern, and before I knew it, I had a great business going. Eventually, we ended up with 4 shops in Switzerland, and then towards the early 80s, my then fiance and I were thinking of family life, and we were also thinking of moving. So we actually moved to the West Country, and that's where I bought an old brewery and started my company there. Traveling's influenced me always in how I bought things, because it was an experience back then. You didn't have the knowledge of what was available, you didn't have an internet, you didn't have mobile phones, so the only way you could actually do anything discovery-wise was to get out on the road and see what was there. As it happened, I seemed to be quite brave because I'd go to places like India and China without absolutely any knowledge of what I was going to find, and I just was very lucky. I always met the right people. And then France was a great source for many, many years. The Americans used to buy off me in just load after load. It always confused me why they would buy French antiques in England, considering I thought, well, why don't you buy them in France? But I believe they're still doing the same. Sweden was a fabulous discovery in the mid-80s. Just finding 18th century Swedish abstract furniture, and then latterly Gustavian furniture. I sincerely believe I brought that very cool Swedish look to a lot of different countries. I've always been aware of a change in the air. So when I've been traveling, the best example, I did a show in Palm Beach in Miami for 2 years. The first year I brought all my Swedish furniture, my 18th century sculptures, and the stand looked wonderful, and I sold nothing. The organizers of the fair were cool people, and they said, please come again. And I thought, yeah, I'll try it second time. The second time I was there, after 4 days, having sold nothing, I thought I want to see what these Americans are dealing in. So I went downtown Miami, and it was the beginning of vintage. And there was lots of young dealers opening up shops. And I bought a 40-foot container. I took it to my store in London. 80 containers later, I finished dealing in vintage. But literally, that's how it went. My personal taste is, well, if you call it taste, I don't know, but I've always looked at things all my life. You know, at 5 years old, I took home a clock face from a local dump because it was very attractive to me. A painted 18th century grandfather clock case, and hung it in my bedroom. So my eyes have always told me, just keep them open. I had a great example years ago. John Lewis, who's now Sir John Lewis, was a great friend and client of mine. He used to come to my store every Saturday to check what I'd sold. And I'd bought this huge Honda Cutter painting from a private house in the West Country. And John walked in, and I started saying to John, you know, we were talking about it, and he started talking about brush strokes and paint shading and this, that, and the other. And I said, John, if you're coming for an intellectual conversation on art, you've got the wrong man. And he said, yes, but you've got the eye. And I didn't know that, and I was 50. I think one of the most interesting things I have in the sale, and certainly something that's very dear to my heart, is this 18th century painted Danish cupboard. which came up for auction, I think it was the late 80s, early 90s in Copenhagen. And I spoke to a colleague of mine in there and said, would you go and check it out for me? The estimate on the cupboard was 4,000 to 6,000 from memory. Don't forget, it's a long time ago. We had just built a huge extension to our property in the West Country, and the whole family looked at this because it was going to dominate the room. And we all decided, yes, we liked it. So I didn't hear from my colleague, and I called the auction house and got a report on it. And I said, I'd like to take a telephone bid, please. So on the day it started at 4,000, I took it to 6, went to 8, I took it to 10. I started hesitating at 16. I took it to 18, and then I said, that's it. And they said, there's one more bid against you. And I said, okay, I'll go one more. So it cost £20,000 plus the 20-odd% commission back in those days. 3 minutes later, I get a phone call from the person I've been working with to say, you won't believe what that cupboard made. And I said, I do, I've just bought it. And they said, well, how are you going to get it out? I said, it's on a truck, it's coming to England. So we lived with it until I moved house. When I moved house, Sean Beam bought my entire house and contents, apart from the cupboard, because it was in the way of his grand piano. It won't fit in my house now, where I live with Karen. We just don't have a room for it. So that's why it's for sale. So, you want to talk about the Frink mosaic, I understand. I met Liz back in 1986, and we became very close friends. Liz also ridiculously bought sculpture from me. Not modern sculpture. I was importing some items from Bali at the time, and she just loved them. I furnished Woolland House for her with all my Swedish furniture. So over the years, you know, we did a lot. Very sadly, Liz died in the early 90s. I did the probate for her son on the property. And then he sold the property, and I was asked to get involved about 4 or 5 years ago when the previous owners were selling it. The house by that time had lost most of Elizabeth. Even her studio had been sold, taken down and sold. But in the swimming pool was Liz's mosaic. And I made an offer to the owners at the time, which they accepted. I then went through the process of removing the swimming pool base. The concrete, it must have been 10 inches that we took out. It took another year to shave it off and restore it. We've kept all the original parts of the mosaic. We haven't had to rebuild it. We took it apart in 4 sections. So all the work you're seeing is Liz's work. I think it's probably the largest piece of sculpture she ever created. And it's within her biography. She did it herself. She didn't want anyone to help her. Because I'm selling my studio, I'm retiring, as you're well aware. Otherwise, maybe Liz would stay with me, but I can't put it in the fields. In answer to your question, am I thinking of retirement? I'm definitely retired from the antiques business. Trading per se is over. I've got 140 acres of ancient woodland and meadows. Frankly, I'm just rewilding and absolutely in love with them. And I've got a few building projects I'm doing. They'll finish and I'll see which way to go, but I'm not looking to trade. But the auction houses are now the retailers, and everything is online and everyone presses a button to buy. So you don't really seriously need showrooms. You need to be online, and that's not what I do.